don't belong in this portrait." Beatrice Whitcomb said it loudly enough for the photographer, the ranch hands, and Nathan Cole to hear. Then she caught the back of Lydia's chair and dragged it out of the carefully arranged family group. The chair legs carved two pale lines through the bright September dust. Lydia stood beside them in her plum wool dress, one hand resting over the ranch book she had carried from the cattle office. Her face did not collapse, only her fingers tightened around the worn leather cover. Nathan had been placed at Beatrice's right shoulder, as if the pose itself could settle a courtship he had never begun. He looked at the empty space where Lydia's chair had been. Then he stepped down from the photographer's platform. "Mr. Bell, don't expose that plate." He lifted his own chair and carried it across the yard toward Lydia. Horace Whitcomb's smile disappeared. "Cole, get back where you were." "This photograph marks the agreement between our families." Nathan set the chair beside Lydia, but he did not ask her to sit. Every eye in the yard turned toward her. Lydia said, "If you did that because they were watching, put it back." Nathan's weathered face held no performance now. "I did it because I should have stepped out sooner." The photographer remained beneath his black cloth, motionless except for one nervous hand gripping the tripod. Behind him, the Whitcomb ranch house shone cream white in the high Wyoming sun. Beatrice stood inside the abandoned arrangement with her chin raised, one gloved hand still extended toward the chair she had removed. Lydia looked from Nathan to her father. "What agreement?" Horace's jaw worked once. "A grazing partnership. Cole's winter range. Our hay and breeding stock. Nothing that requires a scene." "Which breeding stock?" Beatrice answered before he could. "The red heifers, of course. Father says they will make the Cole agreement worth signing." Those 38 red heifers were not Horace Whitcomb's to offer. Lydia had bought the first 6 with the money her aunt left her. She had selected every sire, sat through every difficult calving, and registered the small Broken W brand in her own name. For 5 years her father had called them a foolish little experiment whenever neighbors were listening. Now he was using them to purchase an alliance. Lydia opened the ranch book. A fresh freight mark had been written beside her herd count in someone else's hand. Shipment Friday. 6 days. She closed the book and walked past Nathan without taking the chair. The lower pens lay beyond the cottonwoods, where yellow leaves rattled against a sky too clear for late September. Lydia found the freight gate freshly greased and a coil of loading rope hanging from the post. Her red heifers crowded the trough, broad-backed and calm, each carrying the broken W mark beneath the left hip. Horace followed her down the slope. Beatrice came behind him, careful to keep her pale blue skirt out of the dust. Nathan stayed several yards back. "You cannot sell them," Lydia said. "I can settle a family debt with family cattle." "They are registered to me." Horace gave a short laugh. "They have eaten Whitcomb hay and stood on Whitcomb ground." "They also kept this ranch solvent last winter when your steers lost weight. And that is why they matter now." He lowered his voice, as though gentleness could disguise the taking. "Cole's grass can carry both herds through winter. His partnership gives Beatrice security. Your cattle make the bargain possible. Everyone benefits." Lydia's oldest wound had never been that her family thought her incapable. They knew exactly what she could do. They simply believed anything she created became theirs the moment it acquired value. "You did not even ask me." "I am asking you to remember where you belong." Lydia looked back toward the White House and the unfinished portrait platform. "Beatrice already explained where that is." Nathan moved closer. "Horace, the draft I received named Lydia as manager of the breeding stock." "A courtesy title." "Not to me." Horace's eyes hardened. Then perhaps we should discuss the agreement without an audience. Lydia turned to Nathan. Did you know he intended to sell my herd? No. Did you know the family portrait was meant to suggest you and Beatrice were part of the same bargain? Nathan glanced once at Beatrice. No. Beatrice's cheeks colored. Father said you needed a proper family beside you. I need honest terms beside me. The words struck Beatrice, but Lydia felt no triumph. Nathan had rejected the arrangement in the yard. That did not yet mean he would surrender the winter grass, the hay contract, and the profits attached to it. She walked to the gate and examined the fresh freight grease. When is the buyer arriving? Horace said nothing. The mark says Friday. The rail loading crew needs 2 days to bring portable chutes from Bitter Creek. So you expect them Wednesday. Nathan watched her study the hinge and the rope. What will you do? Move my cattle before they arrive. Horace stepped between her and the latch. No Whitcomb hand will help you. Then I will not use Whitcomb hands. And no Whitcomb wagon, horse, rope, or hay. Lydia felt the cost settle around her. The cattle were legally hers, but 5 years of work had been woven through the family ranch. Separating them would mean leaving the office she had organized, the house where her mother's pressed flowers still rested inside a Bible, and the land she had believed she was helping to inherit. She took the small iron office key from her pocket and placed it on the gatepost. Then nothing I built will be Whitcomb property after today. Beatrice stared at the key. Where will you go? Cottonwood Bench. Horace's expression shifted. He knew the place. Everyone did. It was a neglected rise east of Nathan's range, with a stone windbreak, an old line cabin, and a spring most men believed had failed during the drought. There is no water on that bench, he said. There is if the upper channel is cleared before the freeze. You cannot clear it and move 38 cattle in 6 days. Lydia took her ranch book and walked through the gate. Then I had better stop posing for photographs. Nathan caught up with her near the cottonwoods. He did not reach for her arm or block her path. I have 6 riders, he said, 2 wagons, enough winter rope, and a 5-year agreement with my father that you have not yet canceled. I will cancel it. Will you cancel it because he lied to you, or because Beatrice embarrassed me? He considered the question. Both would be reasons. Neither makes your riders mine. Nathan's mouth tightened, but not with anger. What would? A contract. 3 days' work at the rate you pay your own range foreman. Your men follow my directions while they are with my herd. If your cattle need moving afterward, I will survey the eastern route for the same rate. He removed a pencil stub from his vest. Write the terms. She looked at him. You carry a pencil to a portrait sitting? I expected to sign a grazing agreement. For the first time that morning, something almost like amusement moved through Lydia. You nearly signed more than that. So I have learned. They wrote the terms on the blank back page of her ranch book. Nathan signed first. Lydia signed below him, then tore out the page and handed him his copy. By noon, 6 coal riders were standing outside the lower pens. Nathan introduced Lydia as the range boss for the move. No man objected, though one glanced toward the white ranch house when Horace came onto the porch. Lydia divided the work without raising her voice. 2 riders would inspect the north fence. 2 would gather portable troughs. Nathan and a sandy-haired hand named Eli would take shovels to the upper channel at Cottonwood Bench. Lydia would sort the cows most likely to struggle on the climb. I thought the spring was dead, Eli said. The spring is running beneath rockfall, Lydia replied. The cottonwoods below it stayed green 3 weeks longer than the trees along the dry creek. Water is reaching their roots. Nathan looked toward the distant ridge. You noticed that from here? I noticed it while everyone else was deciding where I should stand. The work carried them into evening. At the bench, Lydia knelt beside the old channel and pressed her palm to the gravel. Dampness darkened the skin beneath her fingers. Nathan drove his shovel beneath a slab of shale. Together they lifted it away, then another. A thin line of water appeared under the stones. Eli let out a low whistle. Lydia sat back on her heels. The water was not enough yet, but it was real. Nathan crouched beside her. His sleeves were rolled to the forearms, his charcoal shirt closed at the throat beneath a worn brown vest. Dust streaked one cheek. You planned this before today. I started asking about a lease in June. Because you knew your father might take the herd? Because I knew he would never call it mine while it stood on his land. Why did you stay? Lydia looked down at the water threading between the stones. My mother planted the cottonwoods beside the house. She taught me every cow's temperament before she died. I kept thinking that if I made myself necessary enough, usefulness would turn into belonging. Nathan rested both hands on the shovel handle. And did it? It turned into an agreement I was not allowed to read. He did not offer comfort he had not earned. He simply returned to the channel and worked until the flow widened. That restraint changed something small between them. The next morning, Lydia found him at the lower pen before sunrise, checking the worn boards exactly as she had instructed. He had brought coffee for the crew and left her cup on the fence post where she could take it without ceremony. The north hinge will not hold against a crowded turn, he said. I can replace it. Brace it. We may need to remove the gate fast if the herd bunches. He nodded and did as she asked. By afternoon, the upper spring was filling an old stone basin. Lydia measured the flow with a bucket and her pocket watch. It would support the heifers if they were divided between 2 watering times. The bench grass was thin, but still rooted beneath the sun-bleached tops. With 6 wagon loads of hay, she could carry the herd until snow added moisture. Nathan studied her figures. Your father promised me 12 wagon loads from his north field. He has 8. He counted the stacks before settling. You are certain? I stacked them. Nathan stared toward the Whitcomb barns. The canceled agreement would hurt more than he had admitted. His own herd was larger, and the drought had shortened every acre of winter grass. You can still make a separate hay purchase, Lydia said. Refusing his partnership does not require ruining your cattle. He will not sell after I walk away from the rest. Then buy from Mercer Valley. At twice the freight cost? Yes. He folded the page of calculations. You say that as if you expect me to change my mind. I expect you to understand the price before you call your choice honorable. Nathan said, That is fair. On Tuesday, he rode to Bitter Creek and canceled the grazing partnership in front of Horace, the cattle buyer, and 2 members of the Range Association. He also withdrew his name from the family announcement Horace had prepared for the weekly newspaper. Nathan returned near sunset with a split lip and no hay contract. Lydia saw the blood when he dismounted. Did my father strike you? No. The cattle buyer objected to losing 38 head from Friday's shipment. And you objected to his objection? More directly than I intended. She dipped a clean cloth in the trough and handed it to him. You cannot preserve my right to choose by making choices with your fists. Nathan pressed the cloth to his mouth. I know. Do you? He met her eyes. I am learning that standing beside you is not the same as standing in front of you. Lydia's answer caught somewhere behind her ribs. She turned to the cattle before he could see how deeply the words had reached. That night, Beatrice came to the line cabin alone. Her pale blue portrait dress was hidden beneath a gray traveling cloak, but the hem was still too fine for the rough path. Lydia found her beside the spring basin, staring at the water as if it had personally betrayed the family. "Father has moved the loading to Thursday morning," Beatrice said. "The buyer brought his crew early." Lydia set down the coil of rope she carried. "Why are you telling me?" "Because Nathan canceled everything. Father says the Northfield will be seized if he cannot pay the banknote." "Did Father tell you my cattle would pay it?" "He said the agreement would protect us all. It would protect the house. It would protect your future. It would not protect mine." Beatrice's face tightened. "You have always had the ranch work. Everyone trusts you with something. I was taught there was only one useful thing I could bring this family. A husband. A good marriage." Lydia understood then that their father had built two different cages. Hers was usefulness without ownership. Beatrice's was beauty without purpose. Understanding the cage did not excuse the hand that had dragged her chair away. "Nathan was never yours to bring." Beatrice looked down. "I know that now. And my herd is not yours to trade." "No." "Will you say that to Father?" Beatrice hesitated too long. Lydia picked up the rope. "Then you came to ease your conscience, not to help me." "What can I do?" "Tell the loading crew the truth. Tell them the Broken W cattle are separately registered. Do it where the buyer can hear." Fear crossed Beatrice's face. "Father will cast me out." "He may. And if I do not? Then when this is finished, you will still be my sister. But you will not be welcome inside anything I build." Beatrice pulled her cloak tighter and walked back into the dark without answering. The wind changed before dawn. It came down from the northwest, carrying the iron smell of snow. Lydia woke on the line cabin floor, where she had slept in her coat beside the stove, and found a white edge of frost around the window glass. They had planned to move the heifers at noon, after one last wagon of hay reached Cottonwood Bench. The weather removed that choice. If snow filled the lower draw before the cattle crossed it, 38 animals would be trapped against the Whitcomb fence, with the buyer arriving at sunrise the next day. Lydia stepped outside. Nathan was already saddling his bay gelding. "We move now," she said. He looked at the sky, then toward the bench. "The spring basin is only half full." "We water in 2 groups. The cattle can eat snow tonight if they must. They cannot walk through a drifted draw." Nathan called the riders together. Lydia assigned positions. Eli and 2 men at the rear, 1 rider along the creek side, Nathan at the narrow west turn, and Lydia at the lead. The portable troughs would go ahead in the wagon. No shouting, no whips, and no one would crowd the heifers where the trail tipped between the shale bank and dry creek. They reached the Whitcomb lower gate as the first pale light touched the ridge. A new chain crossed the latch. Horace stood on the other side with the cattle buyer and 4 hired drovers. The buyer was a heavy man in a buffalo coat, his gloved hands folded over the saddle horn. "Those cattle stay where they are," Horace said. Nathan dismounted and examined the chain. "The brand is Lydia's. The ground is mine." "Move the chain," Nathan said. Lydia swung down from her horse. "No." Both men looked at her. She walked along the fence, studying the rails. Horace expected Nathan to break the chain, giving him grounds to call the sheriff and delay the move until the sale was complete. The main gate was a trap made of iron and pride. Lydia stopped 20 yards south, where the fence crossed a shallow drainage. "Eli, bring the brace axe. Remove the 2 lower rails here. Leave the post standing." Horace strode toward her. "You will not cut my fence." "The rails are mine. I replaced this section after the spring flood, and the lumber invoice is in my name." "You cannot prove that from a cattle pen." "I do not need to. You can sue me for 2 rails after my herd is safe."
The buyer shifted in his saddle. A lawsuit over fence rails was not the clean seizure he had expected. Nathan stepped toward Eli, but Lydia stopped him with one look. This was not his fence to open for her. She took the axe herself. The first strike split the wooden pin holding the lower rail. The second drove it free.
Eli took the other end, and together they pulled the rail aside. They removed the next one, creating an opening wide enough for a single cow. Horace's face went gray with fury. "If you drive them out, do not come back to my house." The words hurt even though Lydia had known they were coming. Her mother's cottonwoods stood beyond him. The window of Lydia's upstairs room caught the dawn. For an instant she could smell pressed lavender, saddle soap, and the cinnamon her mother had once tucked into winter apples. Then a red heifer nudged Lydia's shoulder through the fence. Lydia laid her palm against the animal's warm forehead. "I am not coming back for permission." She remounted and called the first cow through. The herd passed the opening one at a time. Nathan held his position at the west turn, exactly where Lydia had assigned him. He did not challenge Horace, touch the chain, or answer the buyer's insults. His restraint cost him more than another blow would have. When the 22nd heifer cleared the fence, hoofbeats sounded from the house. Beatrice rode into the yard without her hat, her blonde hair coming loose from its pins. Behind her came Mr. Bell, the photographer, carrying a wrapped packet beneath his coat. "Wait!" Beatrice called. Horace turned on her. "Go back to the house." She reined in beside the cattle buyer. Her hands shook, but her voice carried. "The broken W brand belongs to Lydia. I heard Father tell Mr. Pike he would mix her cattle into the Whitcomb sale after they reached the rail pens." The buyer's expression changed. "You told me the brand was a family mark." Horace pointed toward Beatrice. "She is upset over a private disappointment." Mr. Bell unwrapped the packet. "Miss Beatrice asked me to bring this from the county office. I collected it yesterday with my photography permit." Inside was a certified copy of Lydia's brand registration. The document did not win the battle by itself. It simply made the truth expensive to ignore. The buyer read the seal and handed it back. "I will not load disputed cattle. My men are leaving." Horace seized Beatrice's bridle. "Do you understand what you have done?" She pulled the reins free. Tears stood in her eyes, but she did not retreat. "For once, yes." Lydia met her sister's gaze across the moving cattle. There was no forgiveness in that moment. There was, however, the first honest act Beatrice had ever performed against their father's wishes. The final heifer passed through the fence. Snow began before the herd reached the dry creek. At first it fell in separate hard flakes that vanished against the cattle's backs. Then the ridge disappeared behind a white curtain. Wind drove the snow nearly sideways, stinging eyes and turning every shout into torn pieces of sound. Lydia pulled her wool scarf over her mouth. The herd tightened naturally, seeking warmth, but a crowded mass would become dangerous at the shale turn. If the lead animals slipped into the creek bed, the rest could pile against them. She raised one arm, signaling the riders to widen. Nathan saw her from the west flank and moved back instead of closer. The space gave Lydia room to angle the first cows toward a line of dark sage she had marked the day before. The portable trough wagon had gone ahead, but its tracks were already filling. Lydia counted fence posts through the snow. 6 from the cottonwood stump, then 3 toward the rock shelf. At the 9th post, she turned uphill. One of the younger heifers balked. Another pressed into her, and the line began to fold. Eli shouted from the rear, "They're bunching!" Lydia rode into the narrowing gap. She loosened the red neckerchief from beneath her coat and tied it to the end of her quirt, creating a bright, moving flag. The lead cow, an old red Durham named Queenie, recognized Lydia's horse and followed the color uphill. "Give them the creek side," Lydia called.
Do not push the rear!
Nathan turned his gelding across the wind, shielding the opening without closing it. A cow slipped near his stirrup. He released his reins long enough to shove away from the shale wall, taking the animal's shoulder against his boot rather than driving it back into the herd. The movement held. One by one, the heifers followed Queenie onto the rock shelf. Then a deeper sound rolled through the storm, the frightened bawling of another herd. Horace's steers appeared below them in the dry creek, driven by two hands who had tried to beat the snow to the rail pens. The steers were moving too fast, funneled between steep banks, and heading directly toward the crossing Lydia's cattle had just cleared. Nathan rode toward her. "If they hit the heifers, both herds will scatter." Lydia could save her own cattle by driving them hard up the bench and leaving Horace's steers to crowd the creek. The choice would be justified. It would also crush animals that had known her voice since they were calves, and perhaps the riders with them. She looked at the narrowing shelf, the stone windbreak above, and the old fence line running across the slope. "Cut the drag ropes from the hay wagon," she said. "Stretch them between the fence posts. Leave a gap at the cottonwood stump." Nathan understood first. "A wing fence?" "For both herds. My cattle take the upper basin, his steers follow the rope to the lower meadow." "The lower meadow has no hay." "It has shelter. We divide my 6 wagon loads after the storm." That was Lydia's costly choice. 6 wagons would barely carry her own herd through the first weeks of winter. Sharing them could force her to sell some of the heifers she had fought to keep. Nathan's face was nearly white with driven snow. "My Mercer Valley hay arrives in 3 days. If the road stays open, it will be shared too. That is your choice." "Yes." Lydia pointed toward the wagon. "Then move." They built the wing fence in minutes that felt like hours. Lydia held the led heifers near the stone wall while Nathan and the riders stretched heavy rope from post to post. Eli tied Lydia's red neckerchief at the opening. Queenie saw it and turned. The rest followed her into the upper basin. Below, Horace's led steers struck the rope line, veered along it, and found the gap at the cottonwood stump. Their speed broke as they climbed into the sheltered meadow. Horace rode behind them, his hat gone and his face raw from the wind. He reached the basin after the last steer cleared the creek. "You brought them here," he said, staring at Lydia as if the fact were an accusation. "Because you sent them toward a rail pen in a snowstorm. The banknote will not feed a dead steer." He looked at the 6 hay wagons lined against the cabin. "That hay is not enough for both herds." "Then we ration tonight. Tomorrow, you decide which cattle to sell after the road opens. You will not sell mine." The old habit rose in him. Lydia saw it in the set of his mouth, the expectation that she would calculate, repair, forgive, and then return to her place. This time she waited without rescuing him from the answer. Horace lowered his eyes first. "I will not sell yours." "Say it where your men can hear." He turned toward the riders sheltering beside the windbreak. Snow gathered on his shoulders. "The broken W herd belongs to Lydia Whitcomb. I have no claim over it." No one cheered. The acknowledgement was too late and too costly for celebration. But it existed in the open air, where it could not be folded into a private promise and forgotten. Lydia assigned hay by weight and herd size. Nathan took the first watch at the lower meadow. Horace's men took the second. Lydia checked the spring basin every 2 hours, breaking the skin of ice with a wooden mallet. Near midnight, she found Nathan carrying armfuls of sagebrush to strengthen the windbreak. "Your shoulder is bleeding," she said. He looked down. The shale wall had torn his coat when the cow slipped. "It can wait." Nothing improves because a man refuses to admit he is hurt. Is that instruction from the range boss? Yes. Inside the cabin, Lydia cleaned the scrape with boiled water.
Nathan sat on an overturned bucket while she bound his shoulder. The storm pressed against the walls, but the cattle outside had gone quiet. He said, "When I carried that chair toward you, I thought I was correcting an insult." Lydia tied the bandage. "You were. I did not understand how many years were inside it. Most people see the moment a woman is pushed out. They do not see all the smaller times she was never invited in." Nathan's gaze settled on her face. "I saw your name in the grazing draft. I saw your figures in every margin. I still let Horace speak as if the work had no voice of its own." Lydia sat across from him. "Why?" "Because the agreement benefited me, and asking who had been left out might have made it harder." It was not a romantic answer. It was better. It was true. "What changed?" she asked. "You asked me whether I would step out if no one was watching." He glanced toward the dark window. "No one is watching now." Outside, he had given his hay, his riders, and his winter margin without taking command of her herd. Inside, he had admitted the selfishness that came before his courage. Lydia touched the knot of the bandage once, making sure it held. "I am watching." Nathan's expression warmed. "Then I will have to keep earning it." The storm passed by noon the next day. Cottonwood Bench emerged white and brilliant beneath a hard blue sky. All 38 red heifers stood safely in the upper basin. Horace had lost no steers. The cattle buyer returned after the road reopened, but this time Lydia met him at the fence with her registration, her herd count, and 6 witnesses who had heard Horace renounce his claim. She sold him 4 older cows at a fair price, her decision, not her father's, and used the money to buy additional hay from Mercer Valley. She did not save the Whitcomb ranch from every consequence. Horace sold part of his north field and reduced his herd before winter. Beatrice moved to Bitter Creek and found work keeping accounts for the photographer, a position she arranged without offering herself as anyone's bride. Before she left, she brought Lydia a photograph. Mr. Bell had exposed the plate a fraction of a second after Nathan moved. The finished image showed Horace standing rigid beside an empty chair, Beatrice reaching toward a space she could no longer control, and Nathan blurred at the edge as he stepped out of the frame. Lydia studied it for a long time. "I am sorry," Beatrice said, "not only for the chair." "I know. Can you forgive me?" Lydia wrapped the photograph again. "I can begin. That is not the same as pretending it did not happen." Beatrice nodded, accepting the boundary without bargaining. Nathan came to Cottonwood Bench throughout the winter, sometimes to discuss cattle and sometimes with no excuse better than coffee. He never entered the line cabin without knocking. He asked Lydia's judgment before changing the shared hay schedule. When they disagreed, he did not turn respect into silence. He argued plainly and listened when she answered. In February, the first broken W calf was born during a night of deep cold. Lydia delivered it in the straw, while Nathan held the lantern and followed her instructions. When the calf finally breathed, Nathan laughed with such relief that Lydia laughed too. By spring, the bench grass came up green around the stone basin. Lydia renewed the lease in her own name and hired Eli as her first permanent hand. Nathan offered a partnership between the broken W herd and his East Range, but he placed the papers on the table and waited outside while she read every line alone. She changed 3 clauses. He accepted all 3. The traveling photographer returned in May. This time there was no platform in front of the Whitcomb house. Mr. Bell set his camera beside the stone windbreak while Lydia's red cattle grazed across the bright meadow. Lydia wore a deep plum spring dress, looser at the sleeves for work, but cut to honor her full, soft figure instead of hiding it.
Nathan stood nearby in a clean charcoal vest, holding his hat in both hands. Mr. Bell looked between them. "Where would you like everyone?" Nathan did not answer for her. Lydia placed Eli beside Queenie, then called Beatrice to stand near the spring basin. Her sister had come from Bitter Creek for the first branding and waited until Lydia invited her forward. Finally, Lydia turned to Nathan. "You may put your chair beside mine." He carried it over, his smile restrained and unmistakable. "Inside the frame?" "This one, yes." They sat close enough that their hands rested inches apart on the space between the chairs. Nathan did not reach first. Lydia looked at the ranch she had chosen, the herd she had kept, and the people whose presence no longer required her disappearance. Then she placed her hand over Nathan's. Mr. Bell lifted the dark cloth. "Hold still," he said. This time no one moved out of the frame,